Okay, so welcome to LGE Plus Unplugged May 2024. Today I'm delighted to welcome Jaya Chakrabarti, who's going to infuse us with her insights. And she was one of the speakers that was recommended by somebody out there in LGE Plus land. So Leading Greater Essex alumni, we have a community of you who've taken part in different cohorts over the past 6 years. We are supposed to be a movement working towards thinking about whole systems leadership in complex environments and public services, particularly in Essex and our surrounding neighbourhoods where we work and so on. But we have some national perspectives in the room as well, and that's always interesting to hear from people like Jaya, who've worked across various areas. Jaya's got an NHS hat she's going to shake at us as well. So some of our colleagues who are here from the NHS, hopefully, will have commonality there. She's not representing, no, you just have the experience. You have the experience.
Part of the family.
Yeah. So Jaya's going to let us know how she wants to do this in terms of the two-way kind of conversation, whether you want to use chat yourself, whether you'd like us to manage chat for you, whether you want hands raised to interrupt as you go along, or whether you want to talk and then give us time at the end for that more interactive piece.
Gosh, I like it really informal. I mean, I kind of prefer it when people are stuffing their faces with sandwiches, because that'd be...
Yep, that's the idea as well. That's why some people haven't got cameras on. Hopefully, maybe you don't necessarily want to see the sandwiches, but maybe some interaction about what food's going on would be of interest too.
We're pretty easy. I have one potential wolfy dog that might come and tell me that I've been speaking too long and I should shut up. So he might.
Well, fortunately, I'm on headphones, so in theory, if yours goes off, it won't trigger mine. But I think most people in here have met my big wolf at some point. So yeah, we're double wolves, and I've got a wolf who comes to work. So yeah, never work with children or animals. I do both at times. So I'm going to shut up. I'll be here if you need me, Jaya. I'm very much listening. I may be fiddling in the background to see if I can turn up on camera for the end of the recording, but otherwise, over to you.
All right. So format-wise, given that this is a nice, cozy chicken salad-y kind of lunchtimey thing, if you guys wanted to ask me questions, you could, or I can give you a bit of an overview and then just chime in, and that way it's not going to be one of those faceless monologues which I've had done to me, and God, I've hated it. So what do you want? Overview and then some chats? I would say nod your heads, but I can't see any, but that's okay. Yeah, Sharon's up for it. You eat that salad, girl. You eat it well. I'm glad to. That's good. Okay, right. So overview. Gosh, where do I start? I could start when I was 2, but that might be a longer session. But what I will say is that my path, my career path, and my pathway to activism was never intended to be. I was always intended to be the traditional Indian Bengali doctor. I was intended to marry well, into a high caste family and give birth to high caste kids, who would then go on to become doctors and lawyers and engineers, maybe at a push. So there was a pathway that was set for me based on my community expectations and my parents, therefore, as well. And it all kind of went a bit to pot. I couldn't tell you where it went to pot. Yes, I suppose I could. It was a series of failures, one thing after another. So I suppose at school, my A levels went to pot because I lost a friend at Hillsborough, and then that kind of impacted me and our tiny class that we did everything with. And so it shook my results to the point where I was not able to do medicine, which was not a bad thing at all, because it kind of released me from the expectation of doing medicine, and decided I would do physics. Physics was a choice based on the love of the universe. I'm Hindu, and so for me, science and spirituality do not need to be separate for me. I could see the beauty of the universe and the beauty of God and all of that, and figured that why don't I understand that universe better, and did physics. And therein, my parents had hope that I would do a PhD and rectify the situation of not becoming a medical doctor. That didn't work out, because I went in to do a PhD. I ended up with a less than ethical supervisor, who was treating all of his students very badly for very many unethical reasons. And I got out. When I got out, that's kind of when the journey started, because I fell into a a company position where I started running a tiny tech company that was a hybrid between British Airways and the digital agency I was working for, and learned, I guess, that even though Bengalis don't traditionally do business, it turned out it was actually much more fun and much more liberating. So having let down my parents in terms of not doing PhD, also let them down because I fell in love with an Englishman who I was eventually allowed to marry. That's another story. I ended up in business, which let down the whole community and started building from there. And from then we set up an ethical business. So the ethical business was all about, I don't know how many of you have read No Logo by Naomi Klein. I would see nods, I'm pretty sure. But having read that after having to give up my PhD and thinking, what the hell do we do now? We decided, my husband and I, on a beach in Goa, that we would set up a business and do it right. So we would only work with ethically minded organizations and businesses. We would do jobs well. We would treat our people properly. We would let them go home on time rather than the traditional, you're working till all hours God sends, which was really quite typical in the digital sector, in order to make a buck. And did that for many years, did that really well. Not profitably, but well. And we won lots of awards for things that we did. And then got hit by really, really bad debt by a really big company with a really big legal department, and we couldn't take them on. We were 16 people in size. And from that point, we had to downsize all the way down to 6. And I was utterly devastated. Now, I'm not someone who lets things go. I don't let things go, and consequently I will do things to death up until the point of beyond death, unless I'm given a really big shove from the universe to say, actually, you should be doing something different. And this was the shove. So after having to downsize, we managed to get all of the other 10 employees jobs in other companies. They were highly regarded because we had a good reputation in the industry, and so at least I knew that everyone had landed well. But by the time we were 6 people, I thought, you know what, got to do things differently. And I wanted to do something with meaning. So decided to use our tech skills for good. Had no idea how we were going to do that. But lo and behold, before I knew it, I'd met this wonderful guy called Andrew Wallace, who runs a charity called Unseen, which is an anti-slavery charity. And he explained to me what modern slavery was. I don't know how many people here are involved in that kind of aspect of procurement and sustainable business. But for me, it was a real eye-opener, because all the times that I used to go back to India as a kid, and I'd play with the kids in the village, and then sometimes they weren't there the next time round. And I didn't realize, with my grandmother's village being on the edge of Bangladesh and India, that it was a trafficking location. So some of the kids that were my childhood friends ended up being trafficked. And you can still see some of the news reports for Dhamnagor online, where finally made sense. So the fear that my parents instilled in me about, never leave your kids alone. There's the boogeyman under the bed, and he was a human trafficker. I realized that maybe there was a role to play as someone in tech and digital and communications to try and bring the world together, because at that point, and even now, that there was no big data around modern slavery. And Andrew was convinced, or had convinced me, and evangelized me, in fact, and said, you know what, you could do something. The next thing I knew, I was in a meeting with the Home Office, and the Home Office said, the lovely people in the Home Office at that point said, do you know what, we've got the modern slavery bill, and it's going to become an act. The trouble is, there's not going to be any kind of real enforcement from government, and we've got no register. We've got no way of putting anything together that shows whether or not companies are in compliance or not. And we need someone like you. I said, oh yeah, what's that about? And they said, yeah, well, we kind of need somewhere to point companies to show their compliance, but we can't give you any money. We can't give you any recognition. We can't endorse you even officially, and we need it by the 1st of April. We were given like three weeks to put something together. So I took it back to my husband, Stuart, and said, look, we've got this opportunity to make a real difference. There's sod all cash. There's very little in it other than doing the right thing. But this could make a difference at a point where you could have another useless piece of legislation go through that wasn't punching at the weight it needed to. So luckily my husband and I are on the same page on making a difference. So I went back to the Home Office and said, you're on. So the next thing I know, we launch on the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, which seems a bit ironic because of the way in which it all happened. But that was our first foray into human rights, and it felt right. It felt really good after doing lots of commercial work and soulless stuff that looked pretty and did all the right stuff and got the accolades, but it wasn't making it real for me. This made it real. And suddenly, from physics to running a digital agency into becoming a data scientist, that was the transition. And therein started the adventure, because I started to understand how public sector bodies work, and what the limitations are, and what holds them back from doing the job they want to do the right thing. So when we first put together a list of all the companies that weren't in compliance, there were, a lot of them, and it was quite depressing. And I took it to my contact in the Home Office and said, here's a list of all the companies you need to go through and chase after, because they're not doing the right thing. You make them do the right, make them do it. And the chap looked at me and said, Jaya, what are you doing? I said, well, there's a list, do something, find them, do something. I said, Jay, if you gave me that list, we would have to find a reason, why we can't do anything. There's no appetite at the top to enforce the Modern Slavery Act in that way. And I was gobsmacked, absolutely gobsmacked. And it dawned on me, having rewind a little bit, my first summer job as a 16-year-old was in the civil service. And so the Official Secrets Act signed, and I understood then that it was about what they had permission to do, not just what was technically in the job description. And I realized if I officially gave him that list, it might get him fired. So I had to come back and think, God, what do we do now? Because we were asked to put something together to hold companies to account, and government, which I we still have very parental feelings towards government, and having matured somewhat, I know it's an unrealistic expectation that we have for perfection, given how many things can go wrong and the complexity of the role of running an entire country, even with the best intentions. And that can be argued one way or the other right now. So we went back and said, okay, so if we cannot expect government to hold these companies to account directly, we have to create a system that makes it really easy. And we fell into, at that point, what we now understand as corporate transparency. Corporate transparency about the expectation that things should be transparent, and it should be unusual that they are not. And we also then link together the power of procurement. So there will be those of you watching this either now in the room and later on, how much influence you could have if you were given the ability to put it to good use. So we made it possible for not only companies and buyers and private sector bodies to be able to see who they were buying from, but also if they were in compliance, whether or not they were doing the same thing with their supply chains. And we started to bolt on other behaviors that we wanted from our corporates. So we started to build in things to do with gender pay gap. We looked at payment practices, especially payment practices, given that we were hit by such a bad debt that it nearly took us under. I feel very passionate about that. And so the system that we put together enables those entities that are trying to do the right thing to analyze their suppliers and then work with their suppliers to be able to get them to do better. So it's not about name and shame, but it is about not technical compliance, but meaningful compliance. Compliance should not be a chore. It should be a validation of doing the right thing and proving it. I suppose it's been a challenge at times. Public bodies are much better at this than the private sector bodies, but private sector bodies will do something if they are urged to do so by their big partners. So I've had really constructive conversations with construction companies who've said, at the moment, we're not doing very well. But if our big commissioners, our big buyers, forced us to share our supply chains, we absolutely would, because we want those contracts. So there is power in this room and the extended network that you guys have in Exeter and beyond. It's a leading beyond your authority thing. I've probably gone on for a lot, so I maybe throw it open to questions, because that gives you an overview of where I've got to, kinda. But any questions or any viewpoints? I can't see hands. I've gobsmacked you all. Oh, go on, Sharon. Now you've finished your salad.
What one thing are you most proud of, Jaya?
Oh, I suppose. So when we put together the Discord list and all the companies that were in scope and it wasn't visible, we said that we wanted to work transparently with the Home Office in order to make it possible for everyone to be on the same playing field. And we would then, before we couldn't give them the list, then we found out that they were trying to buy a list through the back door, through a third party. And so I realized that it was happening, and I had to go back to the Home Office and say, I'm sorry, but we can't take the money through a third party either. And we really want to work transparently to be able to achieve the objective that you guys all started out. I think holding our ground in the face of, large sums of money when we were eking along, I think it's integrity, it's transparency, it's living with your values intact. Kate.
Well, slightly abusing my position, but I am a graduate of LGE as well.
Yeah.
But when you talk about transparency, I also early in my career had an experience where I was astonished that I was essentially I was conducting a piece of research, sort of for or with a government department I won't name, and essentially some of the findings were stifled. And what we discovered was being gagged, so transparency was ceasing. So a similar sort of revelation to the one you described. But what I've since seen a lot of is what I would describe as pseudo-transparency, where lip service is being paid to what we should do to be transparent, but actually there's still a lot of other stuff going on that isn't transparent behind the scenes. Could you talk a bit more about your perception of that and how one tackles that and or deals with it?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of greenwash and all sorts of other kind of wash that comes out in those sorts of behaviours, and we've thought long and hard, because at Discord we have observed corporate behaviour for 9 years now, and the mergers, the acquisitions, the swapping of people around, and the links that aren't shown, and the behaviours that are ethical in one subsidiary and definitely not in another, and the only thing that we've come up with is trying to create some sort of measure. So we've actually developed, and we're piloting right now, a transparency score, and it's aimed at trying to set a baseline based on the behaviors of a company long term. So the best analogy I can come up with is the speed camera one, where you've got no speed camera, anyone can speed and nobody knows. Then you get those fixed speed cameras where everyone usually knows where they are, so they slow down for that point, potentially causing an accident, but then they carry on doing what they were going to do. You get the mobile ones, and of course, that information gets shared, and it can improve behavior, but people still need to see that they're being watched. The one that makes a real difference is the average speed cam. If they put one of those at every single junction, and you would not get the speeding that we have. They haven't done it for obvious reasons, I think, well, reasonably obvious reasons, but for me, it's watching the behavior of a company over a long term and using that as a basis to determine whether or not they are being transparent on the whole. So the score is intended to help with that, because we show the behaviors on a year-on-year, quarter-on-quarter basis, and we've focused on social and governance. For me, transparency, you don't get transparency without really good governance. it's not sustainable. You need it at the core of everything that you do. So we measure against social and governance in order to establish that baseline, because then anything you do with the environment and the damage that might or might not be happening, you can then measure against how they've treated their people, their suppliers, whether or not they are meeting the deadlines that they're supposed to do in the regulatory environment that they're in. You can see whether or not they're working with their suppliers in a transparent kind of way. That kind of data we can pull together and give a baseline. One number won't fix it all, and we're not intending that this score is going to be the be all and end all of transparency. But for us, it's an ethical take on transparency that enables a buyer, say, to say, well, actually, you need to work more on these aspects to give us confidence that you actually know what you're doing, and the corporate pledge of do no harm versus do no harm should be our pledge, and then we move on. So it's early days for our score, but we've just started it, and we've got a green paper out and a survey. So if anyone in the room is interested in working with us to make it an effective one, please get in touch. Kate knows how to get in touch with me, and I'll leave my email address. Any other thoughts? Have there been any experiences on the transparency front from where you're sitting that you'd be happy talking about? Or anything specific? Oh, there you go, Duncan. Go for it.
Yeah, I'll just come in. I mean, it's a link point. So we have something we call our open data platform, where we try and publish as much as sort of possible in terms of council data to our residents, things that we think they might be interested in. It's not, from my personal point of view, we could do more. It could be definitely put more on there, but I guess one of the barriers is sort of confidence of different stakeholders across our organisation. Say, why do we want to do that? Is it risky? There's barriers to doing it, really. So one of my things is that probably should look for examples elsewhere I guess outside of our sector, but in the public sector to start with, but maybe elsewhere as well, where people have published, been really transparent and been open with their data, and there's been good outcomes as a result, so that maybe other people have used that data to then, I don't know, find solutions to problems we've got. So it was just in that space, really, where we sort of, within your work corporately, or, you've heard of things in the public sector, if there's any good examples or places we should be looking to find those examples that we can then use as evidence here to say we should be doing more.
Yeah, well, actually, all right. So one prime example is the work that we're doing with Welsh Gov. So Welsh Government, we provide dashboards for all of their 22 local authorities, and they can then pick what they want to do with the data that comes back. So many of them have used it to identify who is a living wage employer and who isn't, so that they can increase the number of living wage employers that are there. Some of them have just been using it for basic compliance. So, are they in scope, out of scope? Are they in compliance with Modern Slavery Act Section 54 or not? But then they can also look at things like paying promptly to their suppliers. And I keep pushing this on and on, because having been burned once, it's something that if you've got a vulnerable supplier in your roster, you really want to know that you're doing everything you can to make sure that they survive. So we enable companies to analyze their supply chain by size, where that's available, especially UK companies. So you can look at whether or not they're an SME or a micro and a large company or a medium-sized company, based on what we can glean from open data sources in other places. And you can also look at sector, so you can break it down by sector as well if they're there. So then you can target whether which vulnerable section of your supply chain you want to work with and why. So London, Transport for London does a lot. So we do a lot with the Greater London authorities and their the London buying set. So they have been looking at prompt payment. They've been looking at living wage, and more recently, we're aggregating carbon reduction plans. So when they're dealing with their contracts, we can at least at a glance show whether or not they're in compliance on their CRPs, and just basically ensuring that basically get your compliance right, and then look at the content, saving time so that they can look at the quality of that compliance rather than just whether or not they've got the tick box. So lots of examples there, Duncan. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what are the challenges being faced from where you're at with transparency? I'm keen to understand, because one of the things that we've done is we've enabled suppliers on our system, businesses on our system, to take a pledge if they want to, and it's a very low level pledge, because I know that if you word it too aspirationally, you can upset lots of legal departments. So it's basically saying, I will represent, be a corporate transparency champion within my organization to work towards greater transparency for the greater good, that kind of thing. And it's interesting how many people feel that there's an issue signing such a thing. And that's probably a good place to start, is, are we empowered to be transparent where it counts? And that doesn't mean bearing all in terms of your competitors and, you know, all of the stuff that makes you vulnerable, but it does mean in terms of behaviors and verifying good behaviors and good outcomes, that you're able to be that accountable. And I do wonder, would you feel that your organization would enable you to sign such a thing, or is that a problem from the get-go? Maybe from the silence, the answer is I don't know. Oh, Claire, you want to come in?
Yeah, I don't know. I think if it was a personal pledge, it wouldn't be a problem. I guess it's the extent to which that feels like it represents the organisation rather than something personal. Yeah,
and that's the thing. I guess it's kind of two steps. So being a champion within your organisation doesn't necessarily mean that it's an embraced value by that organisation. But I would hope corporate transparency from a public sector perspective should be a basic. I know that there is there's a local government equivalent for transparency, and certainly publishing certain data. So hopefully it's easy for public sector than others. It's actually how you lead your suppliers into the same thing in a place where they feel really safe.
Mm-hmm. So for me, I work in procurement.
Yes.
So I've got MSIPs. So I have to take my lovely SIPs ethical test every year, I think it is. And I'm signing a fairly similar pledge to that.
Great. That's really great. So we, in the early days, we worked with SIPs, especially on the modern slavery sort of focused work. And they were really fantastic getting word out to SIPs members. I even gave a couple of talks up in Scotland to SIPs members on exactly that. And I do think that given enough tools and encouragement within those organisations, it becomes easier. But actually, it's that empowerment and that confidence within the organisation that makes it.
And we've sort of expanded it. So we've got a number. Sorry, let me put my camera on. Sorry, it's not on. We've got obviously a number of people in the department who are actually qualified. So we have to do it as part of our sort of ongoing CPD. But we've actually purchased sort of like a bulk access to it for those that are not, if you work in commissioning or procurement. So certainly if you work in procurement, you're expected to do it, and I think it's optional in commissioning.
That's really helpful to know. I mean, things have come on a lot, especially now with technology available and the platforms that are available. Kate, you're coming in.
I am. Didn't even put my hand up. Sorry, I had to turn my camera off because a delivery arrived briefly, but I was listening all the time. Claire, actually, I was going to talk to you slightly as well as with Jaya, but I know that what you just described is very much about us as an organisation, as Essex County Council specifically, but I'm been quite interested in what's going on in the world of the anchors, and I don't know whether, Jaya, you know much about the anchor institutions piece that's largely sort of NHS led, but it is working in partnership across areas. So the concept of an anchor, I know, is a little bit divisive among some, but it's the idea of an organisation that has geographical roots. So it's fixed in a place, serving a purpose, and has therefore quite a lot of purchasing power both in terms of the human resources that work in those organisations, but in terms of also all of the procurement and all the stuff they need to be transparent about that you've just been talking about. And some of the work that we're doing in the Essex Anchors Network, which I'm less close to now than I have been in the past, so anyone else in the room who's familiar with this, please chip in, but is the idea of bringing some of that transparency together across partners so that potentially you're more able to buy ethically, for example, or in a green way or whatever, and in a way that enhances the skills of the local community if you do it collectively. So, you might have an NHS organisation and a local council and maybe a local university or something working together to create roles that understand the sort of sensitivities and nuances of the skills and the skills needs in the area, and grow your own workforce, so to speak, or provide inputs whereby you are procuring from local business, that kind of thing. So I'm just throwing it out there because I'm familiar with it, but I'm now less close to it than I have been. If there's others in the room, I'm interested that Jaya hasn't yet come across it, because it sounds exactly where your input would be really valuable all around the country for those. Because I say not every area is doing it, and in our area, it's been perhaps slightly more NHS led than other partners to date, but we're trying to get to grips with it. And certainly some of Claire's procurement colleagues have been involved in that work. So I just thought I'd kind of throw that in as a slightly sideways piece of the conversation.
But any information is really helpful if anyone's involved with that right now.
And I suppose the other thing we're interested to hear from you, Jaya, is that experience of working in complexity. And when you've got different cultures, people from different types of organisations trying to be led, or we're moving, towards needing to be led, how do we do that well? How do we embrace the complexity and yet function and keep on keeping on despite all those potential heavy bureaucratic elements that could bog us down?
It's a human thing from what I've seen, and I'm not saying I have all the answers, but certainly the things that have worked the best is when people find others who share the same values across those organizations. So once you connect on a values level, you're far more likely to create something maybe with huge complexity, but beautiful. It's I think probably the biggest experience I had of this was outside of day job, but I did a program many years ago called Common Purpose, which some of you may or may not be familiar with. Lovely take on leading beyond your authority. And as a tiny business owner at the time, I managed to get this kind of scholarship thing to be able to be a part of something where all the big guys were there. We had, big corporates, we had big public sector organizations, we had big charities, and then little me. And we at the time, our common purpose was actually the success of the city. And so once we'd gotten talking about, well, actually there's an opportunity to change the governance of our city, to turn it into a directly elected mayor. And we were able to pull together, well, I was challenged. I said, well, we should all do something should happen. And someone said, well, why don't you do something, Jaya? And of course, it's the usual, if I'm not prepared to do it, why would anyone else be prepared to do it? So I pulled together a group of people who shared that interest, and we started building from there. Now, that the group that we started with from Common Purpose kind of frittered away, and then we grew a different group that ended up, that I ended up chairing, and we actually won that referendum for Bristol for a little while at least, to be able to have a directly elected mayor. But that was based on a values network. And so I think that you've got to start with that human side if you're going to have it be sustainable. It's not about the numbers. It's not about the NDAs. It's not about the agreements and the contracts. Not at the beginning. Not anything worth something starts with the values. I'm seeing there are people in housing. Rod, do you have I'm going to pick on people now because do you have a view from where you're at? Unless you got a sandwich in your mouth. No? Bit shy, or maybe busy, might be driving. Don't worry, it's okay. Sorry, Kate, you're on mute.
Oh. We have had Rod present to one of our partnership meetings with some of our most senior partners about that very specific point that, you know, housing and temporary accommodation issues are so vital to the outcomes for communities that, you know, sometimes it's harder for when we try and tackle health inequalities, for example, it's harder to kind of get your ducks in a row in terms of climate when just having a roof over your head is the priority as a family, for example.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So sort of the layering of the prioritization there of, you know, if you have to choose between heating and eating, the last thing on your mind is perhaps the quality of the food, or the recycling of the packaging in which the food arrived, or who's delivered it, or the ethics of how it was produced.
Yeah, and that is very, very clear from the research that we've done, which is why we look at the buyers. It's why we work with procurement rather than individuals at the consumer level. Awareness is really great, and if they can expect that, you know, the business that they're buying from is also ethical, that helps. But ultimately, if we can't change, you know, the wiring of our supply chains to be the key drivers, and everything else is sort of fringe, and you don't want to put the public off, but equally, I think the link between housing and affordable living is massive, and I don't think that it's been clearly enough said that if you don't have affordable housing and affordable food and affordable energy, then you don't have affordable employees. And if you don't have affordable employees, your costs go up and your profitability goes down. So the cycle and the communication has to be to those businesses that they've got to put a stop to that cycle somewhere, which is why I think the procurement leverage is massive, given the spend that we have, especially in the public sector.
I'm conscious we've got people drifting in and out, as often happens with these, particularly in the lunchtime slots. So go ahead, continue your picking on people, although if the creeping death might scare them off.
I don't want to scare anyone off, but equally, I would love to hear more about the perspectives that are in there. And it's, let me just see.
Some of this I think feels quite uncomfortable.
It is. I have to say, it's been uncomfortable for us trying to face down. I also found that there are key assumptions between the sectors, so between the public sector, the voluntary sector, and the private sector, that make us incompatible. You know, like dog body language is so incompatible with cat body language.
The language is different, the attitudes, the culture, and as a neurodiverse, disabled, sensory impaired person in all those spaces, I have even more fun with because I speak another language of my own as well.
We speak different languages, although that I think is slightly getting better over the years. But equally, there's a mistrust. So when we as a micro business, we were volunteering to help some kids who'd been excluded, and we were working with a lovely charity that was, you know, looking after these young people. And I'd gone in and said, look, so what can we do? What can we do? They said, well, you know, what do you want? I'm like, well, I want to help. But for some reason, there was an assumption that there was an ulterior motive, and we were going in there for nefarious reasons or access to children, or I don't know what it was, but we found it difficult to help. And some of those barriers come through between the public sector as well and the private sector, and where they feel, you know, one's mission oriented, one isn't. We even, when we launched our register, we were mentioned badly in the House of Lords as an evil company that was there to commercialise the Modern Slavery Act, which was gutting because it was the House of Lords, so we had no comeback. We were and are an organisation of 5 people, so to have that kind of
any publicity is good publicity sometimes.
Yeah, maybe. it was it's definitely one for my memoirs that I think Angelina Jolie will be playing me, and you know, the movie's going to be fantastic, but honestly we were gobsmacked to think that to try and be open and try and hold people to account based on open data could be so controversial. And yet it is because we found out later that there were many narratives about the success about the success of Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act that was being bandied around, that we of course had the data to disprove. And it was being bandied around by both public sector and by the charities that were trying to steer the narrative. They had good intentions, but I don't think starting from a place of not using the evidence is a good thing. I think we have to be really clear about what's important, what's true, what's evidence-based, and work from there, because otherwise we cannot possibly know that we're making an impact. And I get that there are others that have that mission. Fiona, go for it.
Sorry, just on that point, it's really difficult for what you were saying about we have to use evidence and we have to use, facts and what is true, because I think nowadays it's incredibly difficult to get to the facts and to get to what's true, and that makes it even more difficult to know whether you are following the true path or whether you're following a narrative that isn't entirely true. As you said, you were slated in the House of Lords, or something happened in the House of Lords about your company, which clearly wasn't true, and you had the two different narratives there. And that's always a difficult thing, isn't it, to get to the true facts and to get to the basics. And very often I'll sit in meetings where people say, oh, this is happening. And when I say, well, where's your evidence? And it's always that, I was speaking to so-and-so who told me about this family. And that one family has now become the narrative that it's happening everywhere to every person. So I think it's very easy for people to make assumptions and to jump on one story and think that that's what's happening everywhere. But I think it's even more difficult to get to what the facts are and what true is. And going on evidence, I'm just about to start a data masterclass course, which I've been lucky enough to be allowed to join, which apparently is fantastic, but it's supposed to be really, really good in the fact that it just gives you how to get the right data, where to find the right data, and how to use that data effectively, which I think, as you say, unless you start from that position, it makes it really difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think the only thing you can do, because with science, science is a process, isn't it? It's not like science is correct. Science gets you closer approximations to the truth. We may never actually get to the ultimate absolute truth, because I think an absolute truth is a difficult thing to set your sights on. But I think citing sources and credibility of sources is always a good thing, so that, you're absolutely right. If you say, where did you get your evidence from? Well, that is the first place to do it. So what we've put on our platform, we've always quoted where the sources are. We've always said, well, actually, don't take our word for it. If you find something that, if you find a company has actually been mentioned in sanctions on our system, please go back and check the record and make sure that you know. So the truth is not an easy binary thing. But if they know where that information came from, they can make that judgment. And so that is all we seek to do, is to say, here's the evidence base, you check it out, you make your judgments, but at the same time, at least we've saved you the time in trying to dig for it. And that way, you know that you're dealing with a company that, is sourcing to an SME because it said so in the contract, that they are actually living wage employers, and that they don't have subsidiaries where they're paying people really badly. Those sorts of things we can start to unpick to the point where you can be much more targeted in that work that you do. So what's your role, Fiona? And Tony tells me your
I'm a lead for a partnership for children's services, so I link up with all the partners and try and all the things, try and make them see what children's social care is, why you shouldn't refer into children's social care, what other services are there. And just on that thing about, putting in the data and the facts and leading people to that. I'm a bit of a social media troll. And one of my favourite quotes is, you can lead in the data facts, but you can't make them think. So very often, when I start in an argument with someone on Facebook, and I can put links to the facts of what they're saying isn't true.
Facts won't change their minds.
I don't care. That kind of thing. And it's just, oh well.
No, there's critical thinking, but I think the psychology around that is also interesting, in that you don't give them facts to change their minds. You ask them questions to lead them to where they need to be, and you may not win. At the end of it, it must be an argument that you're prepared to lose, and it can't be an argument. It could be have you thought about, you're absolutely wrong and here's the evidence. They've always
tried that, yeah. So
but I'm hoping that in the corporate field, at least, we're not dealing with those sorts of emotions. I know there's huge sensitivity around, well, we're not buying from slaves, we're not buying from forced labor, we're not doing this, we're not doing that. Well, the answer is everyone is buying from a source of exploited, a good that has been manufactured by someone, exploited somewhere along the line. And the question is, have we looked hard enough to be able to make sure that we are doing everything we can within our power to not be part of that? And it's not about being slave-free or utterly ethical, but it is about the intentions and the follow through, and eventually we'll get there. But I think the public has to be a lot more forgiving. The public is very binary too: bad company, good company, bad person, good person, rather than companies and people do good things and they do bad things. And we want them to do more of the good things than the bad things, and then we'll get there.
And sometimes these bad things weren't done out of a kind of choice as such. It could just be that they didn't have the knowledge at the time, and when they did have the knowledge, they changed what they were doing. So sometimes it can just be no fault as such.
And then there's the whole whistleblower thing, which needs radical change if it's going to actually protect those who are doing the whistleblowing. We looked forensically at our data when Carillion kicked off, and the answers were there in their supply chain 2 years before at least. They were paying their suppliers later and later and later, to the point where the bank of the SME was going to collapse at some point. And had we listened to the biome, their suppliers, I think it would have been easier. Yet they had a whistleblower who said there's something going on, there's something really wrong. And at every single stage they had an opportunity to do something about it, they didn't. But had there been transparency about the payment, I think it would have been more out in the open and easier to deal with. So again, transparency doesn't necessarily mean that the truth is out there, but it makes it easier to determine what might be true and what might not be. Yeah, it's fascinating. And your work is certainly very challenging, I know, especially with the shortages in terms of skilled staff. So hats off to you.
I think as well, though, that there's shortages with volunteers now as well, which is, and I know statutory companies like ourselves, we rely on voluntary services so much, and even more nowadays than we ever have done before, to pick up the slack that we cannot afford to fill, kind of thing. So
I've always said,
pick that up.
Yeah, the VCSC sector is the biome of our healthcare system, along with so many other things in terms of community. And the crying shame is that we have a taxation system for the good of our public, and it's much more difficult to secure and keep those entities actually functioning between funding streams that are there, and it takes a lot more long-term vision, and we don't allow our politicians to have that long-term vision. Everything's in 4-year cycles, and then you only get anything meaningful done in the middle, where everyone feels safe enough to do something, and then it changes all over again. So our voluntary sector, social enterprises, and ours is a social enterprise by virtue of open data. We need that certainty in order to do something sustainable. So it's something that we all need to work together across our different sectors to try and make it work.
It is something we've been raising, and very often funding streams are 18 months or 2 years, and that gives you no time at all to do anything. And then on top of that as well, very often the funding streams will state things like it has to be a new and innovative project. You might be running a project which is going down incredibly well and everybody loves it, but unless you're going to do something different, we're not going to fund you. And that feels a bit unfair at times, when you feel that something's really helpful.
But again, I mean, that's one for the policymakers, and for us, the aspiration. Well, and we have. At TIS report, we have been able to gather data that has influenced policy, and I think we could gather data that does that, as long as there's a government machine that is willing to listen and sees what they need to see rather than what they want to see. And therein is the issue, is that you can, as you say, you can still have a whole load of data, but if you choose only to see some of the data that backs up your narrative and not all of the data, then we have policy, and policy can kill, as we've seen with universal credit and so many other examples. So to me, I never thought as a physicist I'd end up here, working in compliance. But I do think that if we are able to apply that approach, and there are so many of us out there working either within government or having left the public sector because they've tried and they need to try another approach. Joining all of that up is key. So it's not about doing it as an individual in your organisation, it's about joining things up, and that's part of my vision, I guess, for this report.
Sorry, can I just go back to your comment about universal credit?
Yeah.
Sorry, so let's talk universal credit.
Yeah.
So when you were saying policy can kill, and what way that?
I mean, most of us will probably know people who have been stuck, well, not stuck, who have had their benefits come in via universal credit with the gaps between. And the gaps between have caused so much financial distress. It has caused a number to commit suicide. The impact of just simple timing, not just the amounts, and the lack of forethought on the impact of that has been massive. And then you can see so many other examples of where things being cut. You've got the carers allowance currently, so that's causing many issues for those who'd had money for care, caring for their loved ones, and then having to give it back when they thought it was theirs to have. I think the impact of those things, changes of policy, they do need to look at the fallout, and they need to take some steps and some compassion around, what was given, and taking it back.
Right. Sorry, I worked in benefits for 34 years.
Wow. So I can only see it from our friends. So I suppose my experiences come from, we made a lot of friends who had no homes over the years, failed pretty much every single time to help them. And the only success there was actually not because we helped them, but they threatened suicide. And I think they meant it, to the housing office, and actually got some housing after many years of being homeless, being beaten up because of being trans, those sorts of things. The system can't cope, so you have to be on the edge of oblivion before it will step in. And I find that horrible. Just the fact that there are officers there also who have to listen to this and know that they can't do anything.
I think housing policy is something different. I mean, obviously with social housing, we've got such a lack of social housing now, which is a huge issue. We've got so many vulnerable people. I had a meeting with one of the housing authorities earlier this week, and that was one of the things we were saying is, well, who is more vulnerable? And you've got this narrative. Is it the separated migrant children? Is it the care leavers? Is it the person fleeing domestic abuse? Is it those with disabilities? And it's this kind of argument about the vulnerabilities and who should be that top priority. And we're all fighting for the same houses when there isn't any houses. And obviously there was that whole law about selling off social housing, but then not replacing them. So we've got this constant battle for something that's just diminishing day on day. So it's pretty horrendous. And it seems such a shame, because when you look at, I think you touched on it earlier regarding housing and homelessness and temporary accommodation, is the huge impact that has on families, whether it be, education for the kids, mental health, physical health, and everything else.
Yeah. These systems that come in play, and there are assumptions being made about, what makes a justifiable vulnerable situation versus one that, they did it to themselves, so, we should leave them to it. But ultimately, we're all connected. And if we have a system that pushes people into bad situations, and then they have to take extreme actions in order to, survive, we end up with an unsafe society that nobody wants anyway. So at some point, we all have to own it, and we all have to play our part. But the sort of bystander approach as well that happens within corporates, as you know, where they all think someone else is doing it, someone else is. And that's, again, if they don't know who's doing it, but they assume someone else is, again, it's about internal transparency too, isn't it? It's it's knowing
I
who's
feel like
caused it.
I actually feel like a mystery shopper at the moment, Jaya, and that I am a recipient of some social care input myself personally from Essex County Council, for whom I work, but I'm also now a carer for my elderly father, who also is having social care input, and I do feel like I'm playing the system because I'm moving around the system that I reasonably well understand and can navigate very much better than many in our communities, sadly. And still, I'm falling foul of all sorts of pitfalls and loops and things that don't touch points, sensibly, and trying to suggest to social workers, think about us collectively, and they can't. So I've seen Fiona's gone, and we are losing numbers.
You're out of time,
on 2 o'clock. So yeah, that's why I was hovering. I'm going to finish off before Fawn hits a set end to the recording, and thank you very much indeed, Jaya.
Thank you.
I also will say to others, this has been recorded, so if you did miss any of it and you want to come back to hear it again, you will receive the recording, but also hopefully we will have shared this with lots of people who by the time they get to this bit of the announcement have listened to everything that they'd missed. And if you're open to it, Jaya, if we had somebody who might want to contact you for some reason because you've touched a nerve, please, thank you. It's lovely to have these sessions, and interestingly, at the end of June we now don't have anyone. So if anyone's got ideas on the postcard and they're listening to this, please let me know. But what I'm thinking of doing is completely unplugged next June, at the end of June, and not having an official speaker, having us all show up and just talk about our experiences of leading in complexity, and have a bit of a coffee chat. So I'm going to throw that out to the room, those here and those not here, and see what people think. But that's my suggestion, is that it's completely unplugged, loose cannon, organic. And we just do that sort of mindset piece where we check in with each other and is our understanding something that we share, and that the idea of that human piece you mentioned, Jaya, of what are our values, who are we, where do we find the commonality. And as a neurodiverse person who spends a lot of time in an intersectional space with all sorts of people with different disabilities and different needs myself, including particularly the travelling and music and showman kind of communities that I spend time with. I'm really interested in how we get that right and how we follow the energy, really, which is exactly what you ended up doing in the story that you told us. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And I hope that's okay, everyone. And have a good June until I see you all at the end of it.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Thanks, Jaya.
Thanks, Sophie. Bye, guys.
Thanks.